You are listening to Rooted to Earth, a SAE Innova podcast.
And the best thing is always to go on farms, because once you have seen regeneration with your own eyes, it's impossible to unlearn what you've seen. What convinces farmers are seeing things with their own eyes. It only makes sense if a farm is relatable to another farmer. So a farmer from southern Spain, from the region of Murcia, for example, will not be inspired by what is happening in northern Germany. Because they will always be like, it's a different soil type, it's different weather conditions. It's just not comparable. So what we really need to build is local clusters. We really see that farmers, they want to share and they like to inspire other farmers as well. We offer the financial incentive for farmers to do this. And I think more than 90% of the farmers said, you don't need to pay me for this. I'm happy to do this by myself. Regeneration starts with yourself. Regeneration starts with how you relate with people and with what you do. And this is in an agricultural context as well as in any other context of our world.
This is a space for real conversations, from farmers and scientists to community leaders and innovators, each of them working to bring nature back into balance. This is Rooted to Earth. Hi there, welcome to a new episode of Rooted to Earth. Today we are joined by Philippe Birker, co-founder of Climate Farmers, an organization dedicated to scaling regenerative agriculture across Europe. Philippe shares his personal journey into regenerative practices, which began when he and friends purchased an abandoned village in Portugal, becoming stewards of the land. This sparked a year-long pilgrimage visiting regenerative farms across Western Europe, ultimately leading to the creation of Climate Farmers. Thank you, Philippe, for being here. It's a cold and rainy morning here in Murcia, in Spain. I don't know where you are now and how the day is going on your side.
It's going good. We started pretty cold and stormy as well, but now we got sun. I'm at the Portuguese coast in São Pedro de Moel, which is a small village. Maybe some of your listeners know Nazaré, which is famous for the very big waves. That's 20 minutes away from me right now.
You describe your work as helping humanity transition towards a regenerative future. So what led you to focus on regenerative agriculture and how did Climate Farmers come to life?
Yeah, I think my own journey into this whole regenerative space started in 2017 when me and a few friends bought an abandoned village here in Portugal. And with that came also a few hectares of land. And that is when I was for the first time in the situation that I was basically a steward in an ecosystem myself. And so I started looking into the literature around permaculture. And then I also found regenerative agriculture. And I was quite blown away because there's scientific studies, for example, from University of Wageningen from the 80s and 90s already, which speak about the many amazing benefits that we have from regenerative agriculture, such as, among others, carbon sequestration. And I was very surprised that this at this point was not part of a public dispute. It was not something that was talked about. And it seemed to be a solution to so many of the issues that we're facing. And that then sparked for me a one-year pilgrimage where I visited all the regenerative farmers that I could find around Western Europe. And from that came then Climate Farmers as an organization. And from that came the decision that I want to dedicate my time towards supporting these farmers in the amazing work that they're doing.
Before that, you had not heard about regenerative culture before?
No, so 2017 was the first time that I read about it. And also credits are definitely going out here to Richard Perkins, which was one of the very first European farmers. And then also John Kempf and Gabe Brown in the United States, which was the very first people for this. And also Kuhn with his Investing in Regenerative Agriculture podcast, being one of the very first people. And Oliver Gaucher, who's now working at Climate Farmers, who had back then also just started his podcast, Regenerative Skills. So it was really kind of the very beginning of the movement. And it was a very exciting time to join and to see this little flower that the region movement was at that point really starting to bloom and to grow and what it is today.
One of the things that we are going to explore more or deeper later is the knowledge transfer, right? Is the way that people can get to know how to apply different techniques or different set of tools to do the food production in a different way. But if you have to take the value or take the way you discover regenerative culture and try to reply that the way you discover it and the way you're trying to get the others discover it.
I mean, I think the point for me was that there wasn't that much literature and material out there yet, right? Like right now, when we, for example, have new people joining Climate Farmers in our onboarding, there's a lot that we can refer to. And I think that is the beautiful thing, that regenerative agriculture is it's very great for storytelling. So I think a lot of these farmers have very inspiring stories. There's great visual material, and other people picked up on it. I always mention Kiss the Ground being one of the examples, because they made an amazing documentary that came out on Netflix. The second one called Common Ground is coming out now on Amazon Prime. Then one of our farmers, Benedict Bösel, he made a great show on Disney. And I think these kind of tools are much more attractive than academic scientific papers. I think that was one of the problems that we're having, that these scientific papers were lying in some database online. But let's be honest, who of us after work is like, oh, I want to read what new publications Wageningen has brought out in the last week, No one wants to do that. And so unless you somehow go in that rabbit hole or you're stewarding land or so, you don't come on that idea. But I think, let's face it, almost all of us have a moment in the week where we sit down on the couch and we put on the laptop or the TV and we watch something. And I think this is the real power that we have great stories that are being told, and ideally streamed via medium where we reach people. And social media has a role to play there. I personally am focusing on LinkedIn. I know other people are doing great work on TikTok and Instagram as well. I try to not be on there myself. And the same is via the streaming platforms. I think all of these. And then the best thing is always to go on farms. I love taking people on farms, because once you have seen regeneration with your own eyes, it's impossible to unlearn what you've seen. I think you can watch a Netflix documentary and then you can forget about it again. But I think once you have been on a regenerative farm, then usually you're bitten by the regen bug, and then it doesn't let you go anymore.
If we want to understand what is Climate Farmers and what are its key goals or objectives in scaling regenerative agriculture in Europe.
Yeah, I think nowadays I would say the best thing to describe Climate Farmers for me, it's a living organism. And it's a living organism that's working on systemic change towards the regenerative agri-food system. And I think what many people don't know is Climate Farmers is also different organizations, because we really believe that there are many things that have to happen at the same time. So one of the projects that we're working on right now, for example, is a systems change consortium, because in the last years, we have been doing a lot of interviews with different stakeholders from across the agri-food system, and we created a systems map last year where we kind of mapped how are all these actors related, so supermarkets, farmers, consumers, research institutions, insurances, how are they interacting with each other, and how are they preventing the European agri-food system right now from transitioning towards a more regenerative one. And this consortium is basically now having 25 different members from across the system, which are meeting online and offline in order to discuss how they can support each other's work. Next to that, we have the core of our whole identity at Climate Farmers, and the first thing that we did, which is our community. So after my tour, I realized that many of the regenerative farmers in Europe don't know each other. So we started connecting them with each other. We started organizing also on-farm visits for farmers. So we have almost every month, we have a gathering somewhere in Western Europe on a farm where we invite conventional farmers to come together and to learn from each other. I'm also working right now on an agronomy training, where we basically have fresh graduates from agricultural bachelor programs to give them a deep dive into regenerative agriculture, because we realize that education is a big blocker. And then we also, on the more technical side, we are measuring ecosystem services. And we have realized that with the hype about regenerative agriculture, there's also an issue of greenwashing happening. So we have a verification for regenerative agriculture, where we basically measure what's going on farms. And this is based on one of the EU research projects that we are in, which is called Soil Health Benchmarks, where we're working with Wageningen, FIBEL, SAIF, and a bunch of other academic institutions to establish benchmarks for regeneration. So to actually be able to say, what is regenerative agriculture and what do we need to measure to quantify it? That's a rough summary.
You mentioned one of the key things here. It's benchmarking, and benchmarking needs time, and usually we are talking about very long processes. It's not a matter of a couple of years. Maybe it will take 5 to 10 years to start seeing major differences. So how time plays in the farmers ecosystem at the time you want them to not convince them, but trying to make them understand the positive outcomes of transitioning to regenerative. How time plays in this matter.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the interesting things that we have been seeing. That I think also with the challenges that we have nowadays, and with the attention that has been given to Region Ag, I have seen a lot of let's say public commitments being made, for example, by large scale food corporates in regenerative agriculture, but we don't see farmers transitioning at the same speed. Because for farmers, you cannot really convince them with a fancy PowerPoint presentation, but you can show them something that is working on a farm. And I think with some of the farmers we're working now for 4 or 5 years, so you see outcomes and you see how the regenerative agriculture transition is positively affecting their farm. And then when we bring other farmers there, they can get inspired. But there is a certain limitation to how many farms we have which are advanced. For example, in holistic grazing or animal management, there's quite a few right now, same with agroforestry systems, but there's very few farms which have managed to do organic no-till, for example, which is kind of one of the holy grails of regenerative agriculture. So using no pesticides like glyphosate, but also no-tilling, which is both things which negatively affect your soil health, but which positively affect the quantity of your harvest. And so we really need to showcase these role model farms, and we need to bring as many farmers as possible to these farms to show them how these things work in practice. Because also data alone is not what really convinces farmers. What convinces farmers is seeing things with their own eyes, and it's a business case. And the business case is not there yet because we don't have the infrastructure around it yet to pay farmers for the ecosystem services which they are achieving. And this brings us to a whole other issue of how our food system is set up and how we're rewarding farmers nowadays.
You mentioned a few times, and it's easy to check on your website, on the social media. It's Climate Farmers is described as a community that is created by farmers for farmers, and we are talking about engaging, about not convince them, if not open their eyes to see beyond the tree. And in this scenario, what role does peer-to-peer learning play?
Yeah, I think it's the core of what we're doing. In the end, farmers trust other farmers. And I think this is the biggest multiplier that we're seeing. And I think that's also quite fascinating to see how many local networks are growing there. Because one of the crucial things with this is it only makes sense if a farm is relatable to another farmer. So a farmer from southern Spain, from the region of Murcia, for example, will not be inspired by what is happening in northern Germany. Because they will always be like, it's a different soil type, it's the different weather conditions. It's just not comparable. So what we really need to build is local clusters. And there we are pretty strong in Southern Europe by now. So we have a very high coverage of farmers in Spain, Portugal, Italy, and also Germany. And this means we're also having local support groups. So we have an English-speaking group where we have farmers from all over Europe in, and then we have local groups in these countries where farmers are speaking in their own local language and on a very, very diversified level, so they can really get the input that they need that fits to their specific context, because everything is very context related.
They are not going to sit and read for hours and hours and hours papers, but in the case information is needed. Do you think is there enough information, not in English, about regenerative agriculture available?
No, I mean, I also, it's a bit hard for me to judge, right? Because I don't speak the languages, and I'm sure there's also stuff that we find. But this is a lot of the feedback that we're doing, and sometimes we're also supporting with translations, for example. I know that in France, there's an incredible amount of stuff, and there's a whole sub-French ecosystem which is existing with a lot of French information. But for example, in Portuguese, there's not a lot existing. Spain, I think, is already more. So it's generally, you can say, probably the smaller the country, the less literature is available, because the less people decide to focus on it. So there is entire countries and languages where I don't know a single person, for example, who can really help farmers in the transition to region ag. And this is then the more you go towards Eastern Europe and the more you go towards smaller places like Greece, for example. We have some farmers from Greece in the community, but there's almost no literature available in Greek. So this is something where, for example, I think that technology can play a role. I don't think that technology is a holy grail, but I do think that things that simultaneous translations through AI, for example, can really help with translating some of the incredible resources that we have in English to national languages.
You're talking about the communities and the local communities that are being created organically or naturally. So what are the some impacts you have seen from farmers in the climate farmers community? We can talk about from a diversity of perspectives, behavioral, ideological, or from a practical perspective.
I think some of the stuff that I really like is, for example, that we really see that farmers, they want to share and they like to inspire other farmers as well. Where, for example, a mentoring program where we asked more advanced farmers to kind of mentor farmers who are just going on the journey. And initially, we offered a financial incentive for farmers to do this. And I think more than 90% of the farmers said, you don't need to pay me for this. I'm happy to do this by myself. And I think this is quite incredible. And the same goes for hosting. So the farmers that I know, which are already quite advanced, for example, Francisco Alves and Joao Valente here in Portugal, they really love hosting other farmers on their farms and doing farm tours and showing what they're doing. And I think that is great to see. And I think that is kind of also the seed for change that we're seeing right now is farmers teaching other farmers.
And how is conceived regenerative in the agricultural ecosystem, in the stakeholders ecosystem? Is there skepticism around the regenerative models or concerns about productivity, transition costs, and I don't know, long-term benefits?
I mean, there's a lot of complexity in that question, right? So it really depends. I think a lot of the industry actors have adopted the term regenerative agriculture quite quickly. But I mean, that of course then also brought skepticism from other parts of society. So, for example, in the political level, I think in Brussels, I was just there speaking there again 2 weeks ago. It was one of the first times that I heard regenerative agriculture being mentioned. But I also know that several members of the DG Agri of the European Commission don't like the term because they associate it with America and they associate it with corporate interests. And there's definitely a truth to the fact that there's no safeguarding of the term right now, right? In the same way, the organic movement is very resistant towards the regenerative movement because they feel that it's kind of undermining the work that they've been trying to do for the last 30 years. And it's definitely also true that the agrochemical industry is very much trying to hijack it, right? Like, I don't think companies like Bayer or Syngenta have anything to do with regenerative agriculture, but if you type regenerative agriculture on Google, I think Syngenta is one of the top hits that you make. And I think that is exactly the problem that we're having. And that is also why we believe we need a certain verification. We need to say that if you want to call something regenerative, you need to have the data to show for it, because otherwise we're very much at risk of potentially watering down the term. Even though I do think it beautifully describes what we're doing, because if you're doing regenerative agriculture, then you're actively regenerating your local ecosystem. You're increasing the life holding capacity of your farm. And regenerative would be the most appropriate term for me. But I personally am also very happy if people call it agroecology, climate smart agriculture. I don't really care what you call it, as long as what you're doing is regenerating your local farm.
It's a long-term work. And how do you feel with that? As we said before, in maybe in a 5 years term, you can start seeing some changes. How do you feel with working in a community and working in climate farmers in something that it will take time to see the results? How do you look for constantly inspiration and the energy the community needs to keep going on?
I think that's a misconception. So there are already effects of regeneration happening after 1 year. So some things like carbon sequestration, for example, take time. And I think this is where the misconception comes from. But there are some very easy indicators, such as, for example, you can do an earthworm counting. So, for example, you can just dig a hole of 20 times 20 times 20 centimeters, and you can count the earthworms that you're finding in that piece of earth of your farm. And if you do the same thing a year later again, after you have applied regenerative practices, you will most likely count more earthworms, which is an indicator that the earth is getting healthier and regenerating. In the same way as soon as you have regeneration happening, you will see an increased soil water storage capacity, which means that if you would, for example, 1 liter of water on a piece of soil, you will see the time that the water infiltrates will decrease. So it will infiltrate quicker into the soil after 1 year already. So it's not the case that you don't see results early on, but a lot of things will happen over time, and some stuff will already happen early on. And what sometimes happens, it also doesn't have to happen, but what sometimes happens is that you have a decrease in yield, and that will even out over time. Because what you definitely do is you increase the resilience of your farm. So over the course of time, you will see that most farms have a higher average yield of their crop, but that you will of course only see over a time span of 5 to 10 years. So instead of having very much or losing everything, you will have a higher standard, and that takes time. So some stuff comes early on, some stuff comes later, but most farmers that I know that go on the region path don't go back, because they see their land responding quite quickly, and they see that this is working, even though they don't have the infrastructure around them right now that supports them on that journey.
Where is the organization heading next? What are your key priorities for the next future?
So one of the core things that we're working on right now is influencing the common agricultural policy, which is still one of the largest fundings for farmers in Europe. So most farmers get 40 to 60% of their income through it. Right now, it's very much driven by the agrochemical industry. So it's 440 billion euros, which are given out over 7 years. And the next one will be published in 2027. But that means that the negotiations for what goes into it are happening this year and next year. So we're working very closely with our friends at EARA together there. And we are trying to get payment for outcome-based ecosystem services into that cap. And then the other part is really on the education side of things. So I would love to see a regenerative agriculture bachelor coming up. And we're working with several universities on making that happen and on showing that there is the demand for this, because in order to bring a new education program on the market, you need to convince the educational ministers of the countries that there's actually job opportunities out there. So we're right now running pilots, and we're launching a pilot for the region agronomy training in September, in order to show that when we train agronomists in regenerative agriculture, they would have higher chances on the job market. Because if we don't start changing the way how we educate the next generation, then they will continue to be educated in the old mindset. And they will continue to be educated that it's good to use glyphosate and to do plowing and to focus on yield and not on ecosystem services. So this is the other part that we're working on. And then the last one is through the verification on really preventing the germ from being greenwashed. Because if that happens, then all of the work that has been going with the movement in the last 5 years becomes, a lot less valuable.
At the time we are recording this, a couple of weeks before this, the mid-February, the Commission, the European Commission, presented the vision for agriculture and food.
Yes.
And you were sharing some insights on your LinkedIn profile. Do you want to share a brief vision or a brief perspective of that vision presented by the Commission here?
Yeah, this is, for example, one of those things where we try to influence this, or to provide politicians that can influence this with insights into it. And I think it's a good step in the right direction, because in the vision, what for me is very crucial is that the Commission acknowledged that we need to see farmers as more than just producers of yield. We need to see farmers as stewards of an ecosystem, and we need to acknowledge that they're providing a variety of services for us beyond food. And this is a crucial part, because only when we acknowledge this, then the next step is, how do we measure these services that they're providing? And then the third step is, how do we pay them for it? So it's not as far as I would like it to go, but it's a good step to finally say, hey, farmers build biodiversity. Farmers increase soil water storage capacity. Farmers should focus on nutrient density, and they sequester carbon. And all of these are things that we should pay farmers for. And this vision is making me hopeful that also politicians have realized this, and that we might see these payments for ecosystem services also on the EU political level.
we are talking here about the EU, about Europe, but I remember checking on the farmers map on your website. There is one member in Brazil, right?
Yes.
How that happened, and this is something every time I have the chance to ask it, is the perspective or the comparison between a farmer or a practitioner outside Europe, let's say Latin
Yeah.
America, or it could be anywhere else. But how this happened, and what's the reality or the differences there compared with the reality that farmers lives in or experiments in Europe?
Yeah, very very well spotted. So I always say that I'm very aware of the European context, and I think I have a very good understanding of the European agri-food system, and that is what I feel very comfortable speaking about. I don't have any idea on what's going on outside of Europe. And these little dots that we have on our map, they're basically just because in the very beginning, when people signed up on the map, we didn't have the Europe filter, and and farmers could sign up from anywhere. So there's a few more dots, and we haven't gone over that. We never deleted them, but we always say everything that we're doing is for farmers in Europe, because exactly that. I don't feel like I can provide value. And we get a lot of requests. Like I even had a major politician from India contacting us and asking if we want to do a project in Bihar, in Eastern India with them. But I don't think I have the knowledge and to actually provide quality services over there. And I think these things should always be tackled on a local level. And this is why we also really focus on Europe, which is already big enough, because I was speaking at Northern Roots in Tallinn now in January, which is for me in Portugal, exactly the other end of Europe, and it was a 5-hour flight, which is crazy, and I was still in Europe. And of course, the reality that they face in Estonia is so different than here, Here there's an issue of water scarcity, There they don't have any problems in terms of water scarcity, but their season is 4 months because they have snow for 6 to 7 months of the year, So it was just like, and we mostly focus on Western Europe right now, but we have now a new EU project where we're actually going to provide training to farmers in Slovakia, Poland, and Ukraine, to 4,200 farmers. And I'm very excited about this because it's our first major project in Eastern Europe. And now after 5 years, we're finally moving more and more in this direction. But I think anything that goes outside of the European scope is basically just too big for us to tackle. And there's other amazing organizations, which are certainly doing good jobs in other parts of the world, because yes, the reality is very different. And I always say to Philippe Birker, who was the founder of Renature, who does a lot of great work in Brazil, that I'm very jealous about the fact that he gets to work in Brazil, because agroforestry systems, and specifically syntropic agroforestry, which is something that I find really beautiful, just works a lot better down there, because you have so much rain and so much sun, and these systems with cocoa trees is incredible. But that's not the part of the world where I was born in. And I think to fix things over there should be up to people who are from there.
Well, maybe in the next step of climate farmers, Latin America is there.
Yeah, I think we will collaborate with others, but we have enough to do in Europe for now. For the next 10, 20 years. I think I have a lifetime of work in making a regenerative agri-food system a reality here.
During the beginning of this chat, you mentioned something that it's important. In fact, the way that Regenerative, it has good resources for storytelling, and you also mentioned the importance of visiting the farmers. Do you remember any key conversation, any key dialogue you held with a farmer, a practitioner, that you remember as significant during these years with climate farmers? I suppose you had a lot, but
yes.
You can just pick one or two.
Wow, I mean, there's a few which really stuck with me. I think one of them was definitely here in southern Portugal, in Francisco Alves' farm. Was doing holistic grazing with different animals. So he has cows, pigs, sheep, and goats, which are rotating on a daily basis. And before I came to his farm, this was at the beginning of my journey, I was a vegetarian for 7 years for climate reasons and for animal well-being. And then I was on his farm and I could see the animals living out there, living the time of their life, basically. And he was telling me, for example, he had just planted pumpkin on a field. And he said the pigs will be coming next week on the pumpkin field when they're ripe to gorge themselves on the pumpkins. And then they're going to the acorn trees. And then after 2 years, he kills the pigs, and he makes meat from it. And he was really like, and now you're going to tell me you're not going to eat that meat. And I was like, you have a point, because these animals are doing an incredible job in regenerating the ecosystem. They're living a great life. They live a better life than most wild boars do, or most wild animals do. They don't have predators. And I was just like, and since then I call myself farmtarian, and I'm working with my partner as a side project since a while on the farmtarian website to really highlight, like, there doesn't have to be black and white, like you can just say, when I know the farm where I've been and I know the meat where it's come from, and it actually makes sense to eat that meat. So that was one thing that really stuck with me. And then another one is a beautiful farm in Italy from Matteo Mazzolla, Isilde Farm, which is a relatively tiny operation. I think they have 8 hectares in total, but he's doing arable crops. He's having trees there. He's doing holistic grazing with donkeys, and they're doing everything on a very small ecosystem. So it really was like, there's no limitations to how you think about a farm, and you don't need a big size to do a lot of magic. And there's so much diversity on that farm, and it's such a green, lush, thriving ecosystem that I found very, very inspiring as well. So yeah, I think that's 2 examples that come straight to mind.
You mentioned something that it sparked something on me, and I remember another episode of this podcast. Another guest mentioned something similar. It's not black and white, and it's not about you're completely out of the transition or you're completely in. Exactly. I mean, the war itself it's a transition. There are a lot of steps, right?
Yeah, exactly. I always say I don't. Like, I think there's so many passes on that regenerative journey, right? Like, and I think like that's also why sometimes I don't even like the term, now you're regenerative, now you're not, I think there's many different steps on there. And I think any farmer that's taking the first steps and just realizing and developing this mindset of looking at the farm as a thriving ecosystem and how can I support nature in thriving here, is for me in the mindset regenerative. And then you have the outcomes to maybe look into labels. But I think the journey starts a lot earlier. The journey starts in your head.
Philippe, I have the last question. It's something I always ask. Is there something I didn't ask that you wish I had, or anything you would like to highlight or mention?
No, I mean, I think one thing is that there's definitely also a lot to learn from the agricultural field for other parts of life, right? I think there's with diving into region ag, I also really realized that a lot of the mindset that we have in farming, we also have in other parts of the world. And I come more and more to the conclusion that the capitalist system that we're having is the core issue, and it's the core reason for our detachment of nature, right? That we constantly try to make things more efficient, more scalable, and that's actually not the right way how we should be operating as humans on this planet. So, for example, in Climate Farmers, we also work a lot with regenerative culture, and what does that mean? And how can we combine a fulfilling life with being in a working context? How can we invite people to bring their full selves to the work? And I think there's a whole beautiful movement about regenerative culture, regenerative leadership, and so on. Laura Storm, Daniel Christian Wall being some of the thought leaders there that I would invite any listener of yours to look into. Because I think no matter where you are and what you're doing, regeneration starts with yourself. And regeneration starts with how you relate with people and with what you do. And this is in an agricultural context as well as in any other context of our world.
Philippe, thank you so much for your time and for being here on Rooted to Earth today.
No, my pleasure. Thanks a lot for the good interview. That's a fun conversation.
This is Rooted to Earth.